In the winter of 1147, a woman with frost-cracked hands pulled 11 dying wolves from a frozen river before dawn broke over the frost fen, and she never once suspected that the 12th beast she dragged onto the ice, half-drowned and bleeding silver-black from 3 arrow wounds in his shoulder, was the Alpha King of Ashmore himself. If you've ever nursed something back to life that everyone else had already called a lost cause, comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Then like and subscribe before the ice cracks again. 3 things would decide everything that winter, though she didn't know it yet. The first was the wound. Whatever poison had been packed into those 3 arrowheads wasn't wolfsbane. It moved wrong under the skin, black instead of green, and it was already crawling toward the beast's heart by the time she got him onto her table. The second was the voice she'd swallowed 11 years ago, the day the Ashmore Council stripped her of her name and her mother's healing satchel, and left her at the tree line, with nothing but the word Omega branded into how every wolf in that territory would ever look at her again. The third was a locket, small and silver, snagged in the fur at the dying wolf's throat, pressed with a single black flower she recognized instantly and prayed she was wrong about. Her name was Elira Voss, and she was 24 years old, and for 11 winters she had lived alone at the edge of Ashmore territory, in a cabin her father built with his own hands, before the pack banished him too. Ashmore was not a small holding. It stretched across 9 valleys and 41 villages, bordered on the north by the Ironclaw Mountains, and on the south by the river that never fully froze, even in the cruelest months. And it was ruled, in name if not in daily practice, by King Cale Ashwolf, 29 years old, 6'4" in his human skin, and easily the size of a cart horse in his wolf form. A sovereign the border villages spoke, of the way children speak of weather they've never personally survived. Elira had grown up inside that territory as the daughter of Bramwell Voss, the pack's chief healer, a man so gifted at drawing silver from a wound that lords from 3 kingdoms over used to send riders begging for his hands specifically, not merely his medicine. She had learned at his elbow from the time she could hold a needle, how to pack a wound with yarrow and moonwort before it festered, how to read the color of blood to know which poison made it, how to set a bone so clean the wolf never favored that leg again. She had also learned, at 9 years old, exactly how much that skill was worth to a pack that discovered her mother had been human. The council called it an unforgivable dilution of the bloodline. Her father argued for 3 days before they exiled the family regardless. Mother dead of grief within the year, father dead of a fever 2 winters later, that Elira, 17 and terrified and alone, could not cure no matter how many nights she stayed awake trying. She had buried him herself, behind the cabin, under a birch tree that still bent the same direction the wind had been blowing that night. Since then, she had lived on the memory of his hands over hers, guiding the needle, and on nothing else, trading tinctures to trappers who passed through, treating the occasional lost traveler, and otherwise disappearing into a life so quiet the pack had mostly forgotten Bramwell Voss ever had a daughter at all. Her cabin sat exactly 400 paces from the tree line the council had left her at, close enough that on clear nights she could still hear the pack's hunting horns carrying across the valley, far enough that no patrol ever bothered crossing the frozen creek to check whether the exile's daughter was still breathing. She kept 43 jars on her shelves, each labeled in her father's careful hand, and refilled in her own increasingly steady one. Yarrow for bleeding, moonwort paste for infection, black hellebore diluted 100 ways for 100 different poisons, because Bramwell Voss had believed a healer without a full apothecary was just a woman watching someone die politely. She wore the same gray wool cloak her mother had woven before the exile, patched at both elbows now, and she had not owned a mirror in 6 years, which meant she genuinely did not know, the morning she went down to that river, that the last time anyone in Ashmore had looked at her directly and called her beautiful instead of broken had been her mother, dead 17 winters now. That forgetting was the only thing that had kept her alive this long. It was also, she would learn before the month was out, about to end completely. The night she found him, the river ice had cracked early, a bad thaw, the kind that came twice a decade and drowned livestock along with anything unlucky enough to be crossing. She'd gone down at first light because she'd heard something enormous hit the water hours before, a sound like a felled tree, and some old habit from her father's training refused to let her ignore a creature in pain, even when every survival instinct told her to bolt the cabin door instead. She found 11 wolves first, pack scouts by the look of their collars, half frozen and tangled in driftwood, and she spent 2 hours hauling them out one by one, with a rope lashed to her waist, her hands going numb, her breath tearing white and ragged out of her chest. She was reaching for what she thought was a 12th scout, already resigned to losing this one to the current, when her fingers closed on fur the size of a barrel and a wound that told her immediately this animal had not simply fallen through ice. 3 arrow shafts snapped off at the skin, silver heads still buried deep in muscle along his left shoulder and flank. And under the silver, something else, a poison so black it stained the surrounding fur, moving with a slow, deliberate hunger, unlike anything wolfsbane did. She had seen wolfsbane poisoning 100 times. This was not that. This crawled. She dragged 300 pounds of dying wolf up a riverbank alone, on a rope, in the kind of cold that kills healthy men in 20 minutes, because 11 years of exile had never once managed to kill the thing her father put in her hands. And by the time she got him onto the plank table in her cabin, her arms were shaking too hard to hold the knife steady. She held it steady anyway. She cut for the first arrowhead, packed the wound with moonwort paste before the bleeding could restart, and worked through a night and a day, and most of a second night without sleeping. Because whatever poison this was, it did not behave like anything in her father's journals, and she had exactly one chance to be right before it reached the heart. She lost count of how many times, that first night, his massive body convulsed hard enough to crack the plank table's legs, and how many times she pressed her whole weight against his ribs just to keep the wound packed and closed. The smell in the cabin by midnight was something she had never encountered in 11 years of practice. Bitter almonds under the copper tang of blood, and beneath that, faint but unmistakable, the dry, acrid note of something like burning ash, as if a fire had gone out wrong inside his veins. She burned through half her yarrow supply, repacking the wound every time it wept black instead of red. And twice, she had to physically kneel on his uninjured shoulder to keep 300 pounds of dying wolf from thrashing himself off the table entirely. It was on the second night, boiling down a decoction of black hellebore and river willow bark on pure instinct, that her fingers brushed the locket at his throat, and it fell open. Inside, pressed flat and dried but unmistakable even after however many months it had been sealed there, was a single bloom of deep violet-black petals, with a silver vein running through the center of each one. Night silver, a flower so rare and so tightly controlled that only court apothecaries with royal permission were allowed to cultivate it, because unrefined, it was one of the only poisons on the continent that could kill a full-blooded alpha through silver-laced roots alone. Her father had shown her a pressed specimen exactly once, warned her never to touch it bare-handed, and told her that if she ever smelled bitter almonds and something like burning ash on a wound that wasn't healing right, to run, not treat, because whoever had used it wanted the death to look like an accident of nature. She smelled bitter almonds and burning ash rising off the wolf's shoulder wound that very night. She did not run. She treated him anyway, feeding him the antidote in careful, measured doses over the following 4 days, sleeping in 2-hour intervals on the floor beside the table, watching gold eyes flicker open and closed, and occasionally, deliriously, fix on her face with an intensity that made her hands go still over the wound. By the 5th morning, the black had receded from around all 3 wound sites, and by the 6th, the wolf's massive frame started twisting, bones cracking and reshaping in the low gray dawn light, until a man lay on her table instead, 6'4", dark-haired, a jaw built for command even unconscious, 3 long silver scars already knitting closed across a shoulder, and flank corded with muscle, no ordinary wolf carried. She realized with her stomach dropping through the floor, just spent 6 days, and both hands elbow-deep inside the Alpha King of Ashmore. By the 6th night, with the bones finally settled into a man's shape on her table, she'd counted the scars properly for the first time. 1 old, pale line across his collarbone that looked decades older than the rest of him. 2 newer ones from the arrows still knitting closed, pink and raw along his shoulder, and a 4th, faint and circular, on his forearm that she recognized without needing to ask as a childhood burn scar, because she'd stitched enough farmhands' arms to know exactly what a kitchen accident looked like 15 years later. His eyes, when they weren't shut in fever sleep, shifted color faster than any wolf's she'd ever treated. Amber gone gold in calm moments, and once, briefly, when a nightmare made him thrash and nearly tear his own stitches, a flash of red so sudden it made her flinch back, with the needle still in her hand. He woke fully on the 7th morning with a growl already forming in his throat, and stopped the instant he registered the pain was gone, the fever was gone, and a woman in a healer's apron was calmly grinding herbs 6 feet away, as though she hadn't just saved the life of a man who could, with one word, have every remaining Voss hunted out of the territory for the crime of existing near him. "You're the one who pulled me out," he said, not a question. "And you're the one who's been leaving deer carcasses on my porch for 2 winters, instead of paying a trapper's toll like everyone else on this river," she answered, not looking up from the mortar. "So I'd say we're square, Your Majesty." Something in his chest did something he did not have a name for yet. He tried, over the following days while his body finished healing, to send her away, to a healer's guild in the capital, to a comfortable holding 3 valleys over, anywhere his men could watch over her properly, instead of a woman living alone at the edge of dangerous water, with a killer's poison apparently loose in his territory. She refused every offer flatly, told him she'd survived 11 winters without royal protection, and didn't intend to start depending on it the 1 week it was finally offered, and went back to changing his bandages with hands that had gone brisk and businesslike, and utterly without deference, which was, if he was honest with himself, the single most unsettling and magnetic thing that had happened to him in a decade of being treated like a weapon everyone was either afraid of or trying to aim. It did not take him long to send Soren, his second in command since childhood, and the only wolf in Ashmore he trusted with his life, without qualification, to quietly look into who exactly had left 3 night silver arrows in the woods along the border that night. Soren had been the one to find Kale's trail in the first place, half mad with worry after the king failed to return from what should have been a routine border patrol, and he was the first person outside Alira's cabin to see her work, watching her reset a scout's shattered forearm during a follow-up visit with a precision and calm that made him go quiet for a long moment before saying, simply, "Bramwell Voss's daughter. I should have known the moment I saw the stitching." He was also the first to notice that whatever the king felt sitting across from this particular healer, brisk and prickly, and entirely unimpressed by his crown, was not gratitude alone. The trouble arrived, as trouble in Ashmore always did, wearing a familiar and contemptuous face. Bastian Thorn, commander of the King's Guard and Kale's cousin by blood, made his opinion of the arrangement known within a week of Alira setting foot in the hold to continue the king's recovery under proper supervision. He found her in the healing wing, changing a bandage, and made a point of speaking loudly enough for the 2 junior guards behind him to hear. "The little exile healer," he said, circling her the way he circled a horse he was deciding whether to buy. "Playing physician to a king. Careful, Voss. We don't crown fragile little birds for pulling one lucky catch out of a river." She did not look up from Kale's shoulder. "The lucky catch is currently breathing because of the fragile little bird," she said, and finished tying off the bandage without another word, which made Bastian's jaw tighten in a way that told her, correctly, that this would not be the last time he said something like it. He repeated a version of the insult twice more over the following weeks, once in the training yard loudly enough for half the guard to hear, calling her nothing but a burden dressed up as a healer, milking a rescue for status she hadn't earned, and once at a formal supper, where he raised his goblet in a mock toast to "the exile who finally found a use for herself," a comment that landed several members of the table into an uncomfortable silence Bastian mistook, wrongly, for agreement. Each time, she filed the words away instead of answering them, the way her father had taught her to file away every insult that came from someone who mattered less than the wound in front of her. Bastian, as it happened, was not the architect of anything, merely a cruel and convenient distraction, exactly as his uncle intended. Lord Varric Cole, Kale's uncle on his late mother's side, and the man who had governed Ashmore's eastern provinces with quiet, patient efficiency for the 11 years since Kale's father died, had spent nearly as long cultivating something considerably more dangerous than resentment. Varric held the only license in the territory to grow night silver, ostensibly to supply the royal apothecary with trace antidote research, and he had used exactly 3 seasons of careful, deniable groundwork, a bribed border scout here, a forged supply requisition there, to arrange for his nephew to be alone, unguarded, and shot with 3 arrowheads coated in a poison that, if it had worked, would have looked to every physician in Ashmore like an unfortunate encounter with a rival pack's silver-tipped hunting party. He had not planned on a banished healer's daughter dragging the king out of a river before the poison finished its work, and when word reached him that Kale had survived, healed, in fact, faster and more completely than any physician in the hold could explain, his calculations shifted from patient to urgent within the space of a single evening. He needed eyes inside Alira's orbit, and he found them in Mira Holt, a servant girl who had grown up 2 cottages down from the Voss family before the exile, and who still, beneath 11 years of careful distance, considered Alira something close to a friend, which was precisely why Varric chose her, and precisely why she hated herself every single time she reported back on which herbs Alira was gathering, which conversations she overheard between Alira and the king, whether the healer had said anything yet about the flower in the locket. Varric had leverage on Mira that had nothing to do with loyalty, and everything to do with a mountain of debt her father had left behind when he died. Debt that Varric had quietly purchased and could call due, with interest, at any moment he chose. Mira told herself for weeks that she was only watching, only listening, that nothing she reported could actually hurt anyone. A lie that curdled a little more every time she caught Alira's eye across a courtyard, and smiled like nothing at all had changed between them. The intermediate stretch of that autumn was, on its surface, almost peaceful. Kale healed fully, resumed his duties, and found increasingly transparent reasons to require the border healer's continued presence at the hold. A lingering ache in the shoulder that any competent physician would have called fully mended within a fortnight. A sudden royal interest in expanding the Healing Wings herb garden that somehow required Alira's specific expertise on soil and drainage. She saw through every excuse and let him have them anyway, because 11 years of solitude had made her forget, until now, what it felt like to have someone deliberately manufacture reasons to be near her, rather than reasons to keep their distance. If you've ever watched someone slowly stop pretending they don't care, you already know exactly the look on his face every time she walked into a room. So tell me in the comments if you felt that too. Hit like and subscribe, because the ground is about to fall out from under both of them. The ground fell first for Alira, and it fell through Mira. She discovered the betrayal not through confrontation, but through accident, finding, tucked half-burned in the Healing Wings hearth, a scrap of a message in Mira's unmistakable hand, describing exactly which private conversation between Alira and the king had taken place 3 nights prior, addressed to a lord whose seal Alira recognized instantly from a document her father had once shown her, years ago, warning her which noble houses to never, ever extend credit to. She confronted Mira in the herb garden at dusk, quietly, without raising her voice, and watched the other woman's face crumple into 11 years of guilt all at once. The debt, the threats, the small betrayals compounding month after month, until there was no version of the truth left that didn't end with Alira's trust broken in the exact shape of an old friendship she'd thought, foolishly, might have survived exile after all. "He owns everything my family has left," Mira said, shaking. "I didn't have a choice." "You had a choice every single time," Alira answered, and the words cost her more than anything Bastian Thorne had ever said to her face. Because Bastian's cruelty had always been a stranger's cruelty, easy to file away, while this was something closer to grief. She did not report Mira to the guard that night. She simply stopped speaking to her, which broke something in Mira far more thoroughly than punishment ever could have, and turned, cold and clear-headed in the way her father had taught her to be, when the wound in front of her mattered more than the feeling in her chest, toward the flower in the locket and the man who had planted it. The mechanism she'd been circling for weeks finally locked into place 3 nights later, in the royal archive Soren quietly granted her access to after she asked, without explaining why, for every supply requisition connected to night silver cultivation over the past 2 years. It took her 4 hours by candlelight to find what she already suspected: a single license holder for the entire territory, one Lord Varric Cole, with requisition quantities that had tripled in the 8 months before the attack on Kale, and never once matched the volume delivered to the Royal Apothecary's official ledgers. The math was not subtle once she was looking for it. Nearly half the Night Silver Varric had grown under royal license in the past year, had simply vanished from every official record. Enough, she calculated with her father's old dosing charts spread across the archive table, to coat considerably more than 3 arrowheads. She carried the ledgers and the locket to Kale and Soren together that same night, laid the pressed black flower on the table between them, and said the words she had been holding since the second night she treated him. This didn't come from a rival pack's hunting ground. It came from your own uncle's garden, and I can prove exactly how much of it is missing. Kale went very still in the particular way she'd learned meant fury held on the tightest possible leash, and Soren, reading the ledgers over his shoulder, said quietly that this was no longer a matter for a healer's testimony alone. It needed to go before the full pack council, publicly, where Varric could not simply have the evidence quietly disappear the way he had disappeared everything else. The 7 days between that discovery and the council session were the longest of Alira's life, spent half in the archive, building an ironclad account of every requisition discrepancy, cross-referencing dates, seals, and delivery weights, until the missing quantity of night silver stood at exactly enough to coat 11 arrowheads, not 3, meaning Varric had planned for this to happen more than once, and half in the training yard, at Soren's insistence, learning to hold a blade properly for the first time since her father died, because Varric, cornered, was a man everyone agreed would not go quietly, and Kale refused, flatly and immovably, to let her walk into that hall unable to defend herself if it came to it. Bastian watched 3 of those training sessions from the yard's edge with an expression that shifted, session by session, from contempt to something considerably more complicated, as he watched a woman he'd called fragile put a training blade through a straw dummy's throat with the same clinical precision she used on a wound. The council convened at midday in the Ashmore Hold's great stone hall, every wolf of rank in the 9 valleys packed shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Varric seated among the elder lords, with the calm, faintly bored expression of a man who had spent 11 years believing himself untouchable. Kale presented the ledgers first, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without needing to be raised, and when Varric's lawyers moved to dismiss discrepancies in supply records as clerical error, it was Alira who stepped forward, uninvited by rank, entirely within her right by evidence, and laid the pressed night silver bloom on the stone floor between herself and Varric's chair. She described, in the same flat, clinical voice she used over a wound, the exact progression of the poison through Kale's body, the exact dosage the missing quantities would have produced, and the exact moment his condition would have become irreversible had the treatment begun even 6 hours later. Bastian, standing rigid near the dais, was the one who finally broke the silence that followed, not with an apology, but by turning to the assembled council and saying, in a voice gone hoarse with something that was not quite shame yet, "I called her a burden for weeks. She just saved this entire territory a war." Kale's voice, when it came, was quieter than Bastian's and cut through the hall far more completely. "She was never the fragile one in this room. She's the only one of us who saw the truth before it killed me." Varric's composure finally cracked at the sound of his own conspiracy laid bare in front of the men he'd spent a decade cultivating loyalty from, his hands, steady through 11 years of quiet ambition, visibly trembling around the arms of his chair. And when 2 of the guard moved to restrain him, he did not resist, because there was, by then, no version of denial left standing in that hall, not with the ledgers open on the stone floor and the flower still lying exactly where she'd placed it. The weeks that followed reordered Ashmore from the ground up. Varric was stripped of his lands, his license, and his name within the council's own records, exiled beyond the Iron Claw border, with an escort that made certain he never returned, his eastern provinces absorbed directly under the crown. Mira's debt was quietly settled by Kale's order, not as forgiveness, but as a severing of the leverage that had made her useful to a dead man's schemes, and she left the hold for a distant cousin's holding 3 territories over, carrying a guilt Alira suspected would outlast every other consequence in that hall, heavier by far than any punishment the council could have handed down instead. Bastian, stripped of nothing but his pride, spent the following month finding increasingly awkward ways to seek Alira out in the healing wing, until he finally managed, badly, standing in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back like a chastened recruit, to say something that resembled an apology, which she accepted with far more grace than he'd shown her over the previous month, because her father had also taught her that mercy, correctly aimed, cost a healer nothing, and occasionally changed everything. Kale's declaration came not in the Great Hall but in the herb garden 3 weeks later, at dusk, with frost already silvering the moonwort beds, and the same brisk, unimpressed healer standing exactly where she always stood when she thought no one was paying attention to how she moved. He told her plainly, without any of the ceremony the council would insist on 2 days later, that he had spent 11 years being handed loyalty by wolves who feared his teeth, and none at all by anyone who'd actually looked past them, and that the 6 days she'd spent elbow-deep in his wounds, without once asking what it would cost her to be caught doing it, had told him more about her than a decade of court had ever told him about anyone else in that hall. He told the assembled council 2 days after that he intended to name her Luna of Ashmore, not as reward for one act of survival, but as formal, permanent acknowledgement that the sharpest mind and steadiest hands in his territory had spent 11 years exiled at its edge for the crime of a mother's blood, and that this particular failure of the pack would not be repeated on his watch. She stood at his side in front of 9 valleys worth of wolves who had once looked through her like she wasn't there, and she thought, with the particular clarity her father had given her, that strength had never once needed anyone's permission to exist. It had simply been waiting, quietly, for someone to finally stop looking at the surface of a person and start looking at what she carried underneath it. How many people in your own life, she might have asked them all if she'd been the kind of woman who spoke in front of crowds, are you still underestimating right now? She never got to finish that particular thought out loud, because the healing wing's bell was already ringing behind her, another wolf down at the border. Another wound no one else in the territory could read as fast as she could. And if you want to know exactly what came out of that border, and exactly which face from this story is waiting on the other side of it, you already know what to do. You've watched this far, which means some part of you already decided this channel was worth your time. So make it official, and hit subscribe before the next one drops.